In January of 1945, a German sentry stood on a ridge in the northern Apennines and looked down into the dark valley below. Far beneath him, at the foot of a wall of rock and ice, he saw Americans moving on skis. Not attacking, not hiding, just moving in small groups near a cliff every engineer in his division had already labeled impossible. So he wrote it down. He noted the skis. He noted the movement. He noted the strange behavior. And then he made the mistake that would cost his unit the ridge. He decided the Americans were only wandering around in the open, doing something foolish, doing something without a reason. The report moved up the chain of command. The officers considered it, and then they ignored it. Because the eastern face of Riva Ridge dropped nearly 2,000 feet toward the valley floor, it was steep, frozen, dark, and by German military assessment, unclimbable. And if a cliff is unclimbable, you do not waste men guarding it. You trust the mountain to do the guarding for you. That was the mistake. Because those Americans in the valley were not lost. They were not careless, and they were not ordinary infantrymen learning how to use skis. They were mountain men who had been given rifles. They had been coming to that cliff at night for weeks, 2 men at a time, 3 men at a time. They moved under the ridge in total darkness, felt the rock with bare fingers, tested each hold, memorized every weakness, and began marking secret routes up a face the German army believed no soldier could climb. When they had to drive steel pitons into the cliff, they wrapped their hammers in cloth so the sound would not travel across the valley. When they finished, they came down silently. Then they returned the next night and did it again. If the German sentry had known that, he would not have written that the Americans were being crazy. He would have written a different word. Dangerous. The story of Riva Ridge does not really begin in Italy. It begins 9 years earlier in Vermont, with a man lying in the snow and waiting for help that did not come. His name was Charles Minot Dole. Everyone called him Minnie. In the winter of 1936, Dole broke his ankle while skiing on Mount Mansfield. He lay there in the cold long enough to understand something that should have been obvious, but was not yet part of American scheme. There was no system, no trained patrol, no organized rescue, no chain of response, just snow, pain, and the hope that somebody would eventually notice. Dole noticed something else. This could not continue. 2 years later, in 1938, he helped create the National Ski Patrol, a volunteer rescue organization built around a simple idea. The mountain was not a playground unless someone knew how to survive on it. Then, in November of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. The Soviet army entered the Winter War expecting a quick campaign. It had tanks, artillery, mass, and overwhelming numbers. The Finns had fewer men, but they had ski troops. Small units moved through forests and snowfields where Soviet armor could not follow. They cut roads, they hit columns, they appeared in the weather and vanished before heavier forces could react. The Soviet Union eventually won, but the world saw what terrain could do when the right men understood it. Minnie Dole did not see a miracle. He saw a military lesson. In September of 1940, he brought that lesson to Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. Dole was not a general. He was not a military theorist. He was an insurance man who had spent years thinking about mountains and the people who could move through them. Marshall listened. A little more than a year later, on November 15th, 1941, the Army activated its first mountain unit, the 87th Mountain Infantry Battalion at Fort Lewis, Washington. 22 days after that, Pearl Harbor was attacked. America entered the war. And suddenly, the strange idea of building soldiers from skiers no longer sounded like a hobbyist's obsession. It sounded like preparation. What happened next was almost unbelievable by the standards of the United States Army. The War Department allowed a civilian organization, the National Ski Patrol, to become the main recruiting pipeline for what would become the 10th Mountain Division. Not draft boards alone, not random infantry assignment. A man who wanted into the mountain troops had to prove that he belonged in mountains. He needed recommendations from people who could speak to his skiing, climbing, outdoor judgment, or backcountry skill. The Ski Patrol reviewed them. The Army accepted them. And over the course of the war, more than 7,000 men entered through that gate. The regular Army took civilians and tried to shape them into soldiers. The 10th Mountain Division did something stranger. It took men already shaped by mountains and taught them war. That difference mattered. It mattered in Colorado. It mattered in West Virginia. And on the night of February 18th, 1945, it mattered on the frozen east face of Riva Ridge. The roster did not look like a normal infantry roster. There were ski jumpers, European racing coaches, forest rangers, hunting guides, lumberjacks, climbers from the Tetons, men from the Cascades and Rockies who had learned weather, snow, and bad ground before anyone ever handed them a uniform. There were famous names. Torgeir Tokal, the Norwegian immigrant and brilliant ski jumper who had dominated American tournaments. Friedel Pfeiffer, the Austrian champion who fled Europe after the Anschluss and brought elite alpine technique with him. Walter Prager, the Swiss-born Dartmouth ski coach who had changed the way Americans trained on skis. But there were also men no newspaper cared about. Men who could read slope and timberline, men who knew how weight moved on steep ground, men who could cross snow and darkness because darkness and snow had been part of their lives. And then there were the ones who arrived with almost no mountain past at all. A city kid who joked that the tallest thing he had climbed before enlisting was a Fifth Avenue bus. A young man from Georgia who had never seen snow before the train carried him into the white walls of the Colorado Rockies. They were not all experts, but they entered a division where expertise was contagious. The climbers taught the skiers taught the farm boys, the guides taught the college men, the men who knew snow taught the men who only had nerve. And slowly, the Army built a force that could do something doctrine had no easy language for. It built an infantry division that thought like climbers. Camp Hale was where that transformation became brutal. The Army built it in the Pando Valley of Colorado, between Red Cliff and Leadville, at about 9,200 feet above sea level. The peaks around it rose above 13,000 feet. In winter, the temperature could fall to 35 degrees below zero. Snow stacked 5 and 6 feet deep. The air held far less oxygen than the air at sea level, and men arriving from lower elevations found themselves gasping through simple tasks. Walking hurt, digging hurt, thinking clearly while cold and wind cut through wool became part of the training. This was not ordinary infantry school with snow added. It was a laboratory for a different kind of soldier. The instructors were not just officers with manuals. They were mountaineers with scars and memory. Paul Petzold had been part of the first American attempt on K2 in 1938. He taught men how to conserve energy on steep terrain, how to recognize frostbite, how to move bodies out of high places where rescue itself could kill the rescuer. David Brower taught rockcraft before he became one of the most influential conservationists in American history. Joe and Paul Stettner, famous climbers with major Rocky Mountain roots behind them, taught rope work, belaying, and the cold arithmetic of trusting another man's hands with your life. They were not teaching theory. They were translating survival. The soldiers learned to read rock. They learned to judge ice, to place their hands by feel, to move by silent signal, to muffle equipment, to follow a lead climber in darkness, each man putting his boots exactly where the man in front had put his. They learned that a route was not solved from a map. It was solved by contact, finger on stone, boot on ledge, breath under control, fear controlled enough to become information. That lesson would become the core of Riva Ridge. At Seneca Rocks in West Virginia, the Army built its low-altitude assault climbing school. Groups of soldiers came through every 2 weeks, learning everything from scrambling to technical aid climbing with ropes and pitons. They climbed at night, not because the Army expected them to fight at night as a rule, because night was how they would arrive where no enemy expected them. A position did not have to be stormed in daylight if a mountain soldier could reach it before dawn. That idea sounds simple after it works. Before it works, it sounds reckless. And in March of 1944, the division found out what reckless preparation actually cost. The D-Series maneuvers sent roughly 12,000 men above timberline in the Colorado Rockies for 3 weeks. Temperatures fell to 35 below zero. Men carried packs that could reach 90 pounds. They skied. They dug snow caves. They attacked mock positions at 13,000 feet. They tried to function in air so thin that ordinary movement became a contest of will. More than 1,000 men were evacuated with frostbite, broken bones, exhaustion, and cold injuries. The exercise was so harsh that some veterans later said it was harder than combat in Italy. After they had seen real war, they still used the D-Series as a measuring stick. If it gets worse, they would say, it will be as bad as the D-Series. That is what the Germans at Riva Ridge could not see from the top of the cliff. They could see men moving in the valley. They could see skis. They could see shapes. But they could not see Camp Hale. They could not see Seneca Rocks. They could not see the winters, the rescues, the K2 climbers, the ski patrol letters, the men who had learned before the war that mountains are not barriers, mountains are problems, and problems can be solved. The German army was not foolish. That is what makes the mistake important. The defenders of Riva Ridge belonged to a military system that understood mountains better than most armies on earth. German mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, had fought across some of the hardest terrain in Europe. Their reputation was real. The Edelweiss insignia on their caps was not decoration. It meant something. German engineers studied the east face of Riva Ridge and reached a conclusion that made sense by conventional military standards. A full infantry assault could not climb it. The slope was too steep. The face was too icy. The exposure was too severe. The troops would be loaded with weapons, ammunition, grenades, and food. At night, In winter, under enemy observation, the route was not merely dangerous, it was outside the category of possible. So the German command assigned its attention elsewhere. Fewer than 70 men were spread along the ridgeline. They watched the valley during the day. They called artillery on visible movement. Then at night, when wind cut across the crest and the cold deepened, they pulled back into dugouts. They left the eastern wall alone. Because the wall was supposed to be enough. The Americans looked at the same wall and asked a different question. Not, would doctrine approve this? Not, would ordinary infantry be able to climb this? But where does the rock allow passage? That is a climber's question. It does not begin with authority. It begins with the face. The scouts from the 86th Mountain Infantry went out at night in teams of 2 and 3. They moved along the base of the cliff without light. They free-climbed sections to test the stone. They checked ledges. They felt for ice. They found cracks that could take pitons. They judged what a loaded man could do on frozen rock when fear and darkness were added to the weight. They identified 5 routes. Some required fixed ropes. Some could be climbed by highly skilled men without them. All of them were dangerous. None of them were impossible. That distinction was the battle before the battle. To the German system, the cliff had already answered the question. To the Americans, the cliff had not answered anything until a climber put his hand on it. The plan that grew from those nights belonged to Major General George P. Hayes, commander of the 10th Mountain Division. Hayes was not a mountain man. He was a career artillery officer, a Medal of Honor recipient from World War I, and a commander who understood one strategic fact with absolute clarity. Monte Belvedere could not be taken while German observers sat on Riva Ridge. The ridge overlooked the approaches. It controlled the valley. It allowed German artillery to punish movement. If the Allies attacked Belvedere while Riva Ridge remained in German hands, they would bleed for ground they could barely reach. But if Riva Ridge fell first, the entire front changed. The problem was how to take it. From the west, the slopes were gentler but exposed. German observers would see the assault coming. From the east, the wall was undefended because the enemy believed it did not exist as an approach. So Hayes chose the route the Germans had removed from their minds. He gave the job to the 1st Battalion, 86th Mountain Infantry, reinforced by F Company. Roughly 1,000 men would move into the operation, with about 700 making the central climb across the 5 routes. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hampton would command the assault. Before the climb, Hampton gave an order that told every man exactly what kind of night this would be. Weapons would remain unloaded during the ascent. An accidental shot on a frozen cliff, in total darkness, with hundreds of men strung across exposed rock and a German garrison above them, could destroy the entire operation before the first objective was reached. Rifles would be carried. Ammunition would be carried. Grenades would be carried. Rations for 2 days would be carried. Blankets would not. There was no room for comfort in the weight budget. The men would be cold. The solution was movement. On February 17, 1945, the assault companies moved toward their waiting positions. On February 18th, they lay hidden through the day. No fires, no unnecessary talk, no movement that could catch an eye from the ridge. Above them, the German defenders watched the ordinary valley they believed they understood. Below them, the Americans waited for the light to fail. At about 7:30 that evening, the climb began. The night was moonless. A thin overcast covered the stars. The men blackened their faces and hands with soot so skin would not flash pale in the dark. They taped their dog tags so metal would not tap against metal. They filled canteens only halfway so water would not slosh. Anything that could betray them was wrapped, tied down, removed, or silenced. The order was not complicated. Silence. Complete silence. One dropped weapon, one loose rock, one shouted word, one canteen clattering against stone, and the Germans would wake to find hundreds of Americans suspended on the face below them with unloaded rifles and nowhere to hide. That would not have been a firefight. It would have been a slaughter. Ahead of each assault column moved the expert climbers. They went first, half an hour before the main body, feeling out the route in the dark and fixing ropes only where the rock demanded it. Behind them came the line, one man after another. Boot into the mark of the boot ahead, hand to the same hold, weight transferred carefully, breath held when stone shifted. No one could see the full cliff. Most could barely see the man in front of them. They climbed inside a narrow world of dark rock, cold fingers, scraping soles, and the knowledge that a mistake would travel down the line. A veteran later remembered the silence more than anything else, the breathing of the man behind him, the small scrape of boot leather on frozen stone, the creak of equipment under strain, wind far below in the valley. Nothing more. Sergeant Jack Parker of Company C climbed with a .30 caliber machine gun tripod in addition to his own weapon. Parker was also the division's combat artist. There were no photographers on that cliff, no clean, heroic image of the ascent as it happened. Only the men, the dark, and later, Parker's drawings. He made some of those sketches with water melted from snow, or with a tablet dampened by spit when nothing else was available. That was the visual record of the climb the Germans had said could not be made. Not a photograph. A memory scratched onto paper by a man who had carried part of a machine gun up an icy wall in the dark. Before dawn on February 19th, the final assault unit reported that it was in position. All 5 summit objectives had been reached. Fog settled across the ridge in the early morning, covering the crest like a curtain. 2,000 feet of frozen rock had been climbed in darkness. Hundreds of men had reached the top with combat loads. The operation had produced essentially one casualty during the ascent, one wounded man. Everyone else got up. Then the German sentries came back to their observation posts. They were not prepared for what they found. The Americans were already there, not below them, not approaching from the expected slope. There, on the ridge, inside the position. The defenders were overrun within minutes. Some had been sleeping in dugouts because no attack was supposed to come from that side. General Hayes later described it bluntly. The Americans took the German guns, turned them around, went to the dugouts, and threw grenades in. That was how the defenders woke up. A captured German officer tried to explain the shock in his own way. He had not believed American soldiers could climb anything that awkward. He was not admitting a personal failure of imagination. He was speaking for a whole chain of command. The east face of Riva Ridge had been assessed as unscalable, and by the standards used for ordinary military capability, that judgment was not absurd. The error was not that the cliff was easy. The error was assuming the Americans on the other side of the valley were ordinary. They were not. They were climbers in uniform. And that is why the difference between German mountain troops and the 10th Mountain Division mattered. The Gebirgsjäger were soldiers trained for mountains. The men on Riva Ridge were mountain men trained for war. That sounds like a small distinction until you put it on a cliff at night. One system begins with the army and adds the mountain. The other begins with the mountain and adds the army. One asks what the doctrine permits. The other asks where the route goes. On February 19th, the Germans had to answer for that distinction while the Americans held the ridge they were never supposed to reach. The counterattacks came quickly. The German command sent available reserves to retake the position. The 232nd Fusilier Battalion was thrown in. Elite high mountain troops were brought forward. Company-sized attacks hit the ridge again and again. For 5 days, Riva Ridge was not a single dramatic climb anymore. It was a brutal defensive fight along exposed summits, knife-edge ground, and positions that could be shelled from multiple directions. Lieutenant James Luce and his platoon found themselves defending Pizzo di Campiano while Germans pressed from 3 sides. At points, the fighting was so close that American artillery had to be called onto American positions because the enemy was too near to stop any other way. Lieutenant Colonel Hampton personally led reinforcements across exposed ground under mortar fire because there was no safer route, only the route that existed. Lieutenant John McCown, a serious Teton climber before the war and a climbing instructor at Camp Hale, charged a German machine gun position along the ridge to break the pressure. He and 6 of his men were killed. The Americans held. By February 24th, the ridge was declared secure. By February 25th, the full ridgeline was in American hands. Then the engineers did something almost as symbolic as the climb. The 126th Engineer Mountain Battalion built an aerial tramway up the same eastern face the Germans had called Unclimbable. And 1,800-foot supply line rose over the frozen wall. In 5 days, it carried more than 10 tons of ammunition and supplies to the men holding the crest. The mountain had been reclassified, not by report, by use. With Riva Ridge gone from German control, the assault on Monte Belvedere could begin. The main attack followed the next night. Battalions of the 85th, 86th, and 87th Mountain Infantry moved against positions that had helped stop the Allied advance through the winter. The fighting was vicious. Belvedere did not fall because Riva Ridge had fallen easily. It fell because the ridge had been removed from the German system of observation and artillery control. By February 24th, the peaks that had blocked the front were in Allied hands. Commanders had expected the operation to take much longer and cost far more. Instead, in 5 days, the 10th Mountain Division helped crack open a line that had held through the winter. But the cost did not stay abstract. It fell onto men with names. On March 3, 1945, Torger Tokel, the ski jumper, once called the Babe Ruth of his sport, was killed near Iola di Montese. He had moved forward with a bazooka to engage a German machine gun. An artillery shell detonated ammunition he was carrying. Tokel and his ammunition carrier, Sergeant Arthur Tokela, were killed instantly. Tokel was 25 years old, 4 days from 26. He had left Norway for America before the war, then watched the Nazis overrun the country he had left behind. He brought that private anger into the mountains of Italy. He did not come home. That same day, Pete Siebert, a 20-year-old platoon sergeant, was hit by mortar fire near Monte della Torraccia. Shrapnel tore through his helmet. His left arm was nearly severed. His right kneecap was destroyed. His femur was broken. Doctors told him he might never walk again. He would spend months and months in hospitals, proving them wrong. On April 14th, the division endured its bloodiest day. Near Castel Diano, Private First Class John D. McGrath, a 20-year-old radio operator from Connecticut, charged German machine gun positions with an M1 rifle, captured a gun, and used it to clear more positions before mortar fire killed him. He would receive the Medal of Honor. That same day, a young lieutenant from Kansas named Bob Dole was hit by German machine gun fire while leading his platoon on Hill 913. The rounds shattered his right shoulder and back. He lay in a foxhole for hours before he could be reached. Doctors doubted he would survive. He did survive. He would spend years in military hospitals, lose most use of his right arm, and decades later become one of the most recognizable political figures in America. The 10th Mountain Division fought only 114 days in Italy. But in those 114 days, nearly 1,000 of its men were killed, and more than 4,000 were wounded. For a division that entered combat late, the price was staggering. They pushed through the final Allied offensive in Italy. They crossed the Po River. They drove toward Lake Garda and the edge of the Alps. On May 2nd, 1945, German forces in Italy surrendered. One German commander, General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, chose to surrender his command specifically to a detachment of the 10th Mountain Division. He had watched what they had done. Riva Ridge, Belvedere, the breakthrough, the pursuit. A professional soldier from an old European military tradition understood that this strange American division had earned something more than victory. It had forced recognition. Then the surviving men went home and did something no American division has ever done in quite the same way. They helped build the modern American ski industry. Pete Siebert, the man doctors said might never ski again, won a major alpine race in 1947. In the early 1960s, he and Earl Eaton climbed an unnamed mountain in Colorado and saw what it could become. In 1962, Vail opened. The longest run on that mountain is called Riva Ridge. Friedel Pfeiffer helped build Aspen. Percy Rideout, who led Company F up the ridge and was wounded in the face, became part of Aspen's ski school. Veterans of the division helped found or shape Arapahoe Basin, Snowmass, Breckenridge, outdoor leadership programs, backcountry hut systems, and ski schools across the country. Documentation after the war connected 10th Mountain veterans to dozens of American ski resorts. The men who had been recruited because they understood mountains returned to those mountains and built lives from that knowledge. That is the final irony of Riva Ridge. The German defenders were not wrong because the cliff was easy. The cliff was not easy. It was cold, dark, exposed, and deadly. They were wrong because they assumed difficulty and impossibility were the same thing. They were wrong because their system had measured the mountain against ordinary soldiers. The men below the ridge were not ordinary soldiers. They were ski racers, climbers, rescue men, guides, rangers, instructors, and boys taught by those men until they became something else. They had been trained by an army camp at 9,200 feet. They had been hardened at 35 below zero. They had been taught by men who had climbed the highest mountains in the world, and by men who knew the American backcountry better than any manual could describe. So when they looked at a 2,000-foot wall of frozen Italian rock, they did not see a line in an engineering report. They saw a route. Hard, dangerous, possibly fatal, but still a route. The German soldier in the Valley report saw Americans moving beneath the cliff and thought they were wandering. He was watching the first half of an answer. He just did not understand the question. On the night of February 18th, 1945, 700 men climbed into the dark with unloaded rifles, taped dog tags, half-filled canteens, and enough mountain experience to challenge an army's definition of impossible. They reached the top before dawn. They found the defenders sleeping, and they proved that when a man declares a mountain impossible, he may not be describing the mountain. He may only be describing the limits of the men he imagines climbing it.